Well, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this first winter lecture for 2020. And it's the first fully in-person winter lecture since 2020. Did I say this was the first one for 2020?
You did.
Okay, this is the first one for 2022, and it's the first fully in-person one since 2020. I'm Nicola Hogarth-Cregan, co-director of NZCIS with Dr. Graham Finlay, who's down the back. And some of his books are for sale on the table. And if anyone wants to give me $20, they can do for that book. We're very pleased to be hosting this new series and this conversation. And we have a wonderful lineup of speakers. So please do come back on Wednesday next week and the week after for the following two lectures. NZCIS is funded by the Templeton World Charity and by Maclaurin Goodfellow Trust and by Wilberforce. And we thank all our funders. We couldn't do this without you. And in particular, we also thank Maclaurin Chapel and its chaplain, Tim, somewhere, for the warm welcome and hospitality in the last 6 years. It's great to continue this partnership and these lectures for 6 years. And a very warm welcome to Lyndon, the Venerable Dr. Lyndon Drake. Lyndon, you only have to live up to the high standards set last year by Ashley Bloomfield, but I am sure you'll manage that. The Venerable Dr. Lyndon Drake of Ngātahu serves as the Archdeacon of Tāmaki Makaurau in the Māori Anglican Bishopric of Titai Tokerau. Until 2010, Lyndon was a Vice President at Barclays Capital, trading government bonds and interest rate derivatives, so he had another life. But since then, he has served as a pastor in a city-centre church, as well as teaching theology and serving in a range of Christian leadership roles. Lyndon has undergraduate degrees in science and commerce and a doctorate in computer science from York University and 2 degrees in theology from Oxford, where he is completing a second doctorate in theology, looking at the idea of economic capital in the Hebrew Bible. So he is ideally qualified, therefore, to open our discussion on Mātauranga Māori, and he will propose a framework which helps to make sense of different kinds of knowledge in religion, science, and Mātauranga Māori. I should add here that these are exploratory talks for all concerned, that this is a contested kaupapa, and they should not be understood as position papers or official statements from NZCIS. I'm extremely enthusiastic about this, but we all hold a diversity of views, as is common out there, and we all hope to be informed and perhaps to have our views changed by this series. And before I hand over for a Karakia, I should also have a shout out to Mayor Roberts, who is where? Back there. So Dr. Mayor Roberts and Peter Wills wrote a paper in the late 90s, long before we all got involved with this subject, and it's a brilliant paper and it should be read by everybody. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask Tiariki to come and lead us in a Karakia. I think he's going to get us to sing, actually. So, thank you. Yes.
Kia mai tata katoa, he mai nei te niwa. Nani kia kauta katoa, tira kia koe taranga te tāma nei te niwa, Lyndon. Nei mai, whakatau mai rai, ki rongi tēnei. Whare Karakia e tēnei wā, nami ka wana ki a koe. O tira kia kauta ngā whaia, mi ngā mātua tara mai nei tēnei wā, nami ka wana ki a kauta katoa. Mi inyo te tātou, ne? Ki te kati. He honore, he korore ki te atua, he maungarunga ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Hanga e te atua he ngā kauhau ki roto ki tēnā o mātou. Whakatongia tō wairua tapu, hei awhina, hei tohutohu i a mātou, hei oko hoki i ngā mātauranga o te kaupapa nai nei. Ka tuku atu ngā whakamoimiti me ngā whakawhetai ki a koe moa ki tonu atu. Āmene. Nō reire kia tātou katoa, he tino mihi kawana ki a koutou katoa. Kone tapu i wātua tai, hara mai nei konei hoki. Hui oe anō, he mihi kawana ki ngā kai whakarite, o tira ki a koutou ngā kai whakahaere, ki a koe te rangatira Tim, tēnā koe o tira Nicola hoki. Koutou katoa, ngā kau mātou ngā whaia mā, o te whare Karakia nei, he mihi kawana ki a koutou katoa. He tino nākau nui ana au mō tēnei kaupapa e hangai ana ki te Mātauranga Māori me ki te ako i ngā āhuatanga i roto i tēnei wāhi. I roto i tēnei wāhi. Me te pātai nui ki a tātou, hea tēnei mea te atua kei roto i tēnei wāhi hoki ne. Koe te kaiarihi o te whareputai au i konei, konei tapu tino pātai hoki ki au, ia tēnei mea. Te atua nui, te atua ka harawa. O rei ki a tātou katoa ki a koe e te rangatira, e te minata hoki a Lyndon. E nui ngā kore o marungi te pukumata me ki, e whāna ki enei o ngā take, e me ngā amu kei Wainga Nui i te take nei. Nō reira, ka tino hariko te ngā kei ki te kiti a koe i tēnei wā, me ngā pukinga kei Wainga Nui a koe, nō reira ka tika ka mihi. Ka mihi ki a koe ki a koutou katoa i roto i tēnei wāhi o tātou nei, o waipapa tau Mātaurau, te whare nei, te me ki nā mihi ki te mana whenui konei nā te whātua ki o rākei me te moana nui a Waiata. Kei konei, mātou ki ta tautoko i tēnei kaupapa, e kaupapa whakahira, e kaupapa e kaupapa awangawanga hoki, he oi anō e kaupapa tino pai ki a tātou katoa. So, kia ora everybody. I actually just met Nicola 2 hours ago, just outside there as I was coming through. So I had no idea that I was going to be opening up for the Karakia for today. But I think it was the Holy Spirit. And I think me and Nicola, when I first spoke with her, I was thinking she was a little bit scary and I didn't really want to talk to her again. But for some reason, the Holy Spirit brought me back over here as well. I'm the kaiarihi for the science faculty. So I am a Christian. I'm a person of faith as well from the Lyndon Church. And so I think, it is appropriate that I'm here as well in terms of this kaupapa, but also to really learn also from Lyndon as well, because we have had many kōrero too about this kaupapa. Because I've only been quite new in this role for 5 months, and there's been a bit of awanga of how to navigate this space as a Christian who is in a high strategic role, particularly in the Faculty of Science as well. I also mihi atu kia Whai Mere Roberts. We were both in the hui for Te Taure Here Putai Ao, and she's the actual reason why we're here. She said, hey, all you academics and professionals, you need to come to this hui right now, and so nā mihi ka ani ki a koe. O te rā ki te whānui, tēnā koutou. Nicola, I'm looking at you, got to come up here for the Waiata. Tēnā koutou katoa. Nicola, hara mai. John, ko koe hoki. Te aroha. Hara mai. Come. Tim. She's a little bit too. I'm talking to you. Somebody. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi mari e tātou e. Te aroha, te Apitona tate hona ki tonga mate, apitona tate hona ki tonga rā, o te raki a katoa e tā mai nei, tēnei wā, o te raki a koe i te rangatira, tēnā koutou. Kia ora mai tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Mihi mai i te rangatira, e te araki, ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Whakamoe me ti hoki, ki te wairua tapu o te atua, mō tāna whakahaere o koe, ki te whakarahi i a koe ki konei, i tēnei pō, mō te Karakia, mō te whakanoa, mō te whakatau o te hui nei. Tēnā koe. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, kua hui mai nei, I raro I te tūnui o te whare Karakia nei, I raro I te korowai o te atua kotahi, te atua matua tama wairua tapu. Ki a koe I te kaiwhakahaere o te whare Karakia nei, e Tim, tēnā koe, ngā mihi nui ki a koe, ki a koe e te takuta e Nicola, ngā mihi nui. Ki a koutou katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It's a great privilege to be in front of you, but I'm rather nervous about the topic in the sense that, as Nicola alluded to, this is a deeply contested topic. And there is every chance that I can offend not only many people in this room, but later on YouTube, numerous other people who I've never even met. And so I guess the only option is to press on ahead with what I've prepared. But what I do want to do to preface my remarks, and thank you, Nicola, for the very warm introduction, you'll notice that I've put my institutional affiliation at the moment as the University of Oxford. The reason for that is I'm studying theology there at the moment, and whilst I have a background in science, in academic science, and in finance, and I have whakapapa Māori, and am deeply immersed these days in the Māori world, I cannot pretend to put myself forward as an expert on Mātauranga. But like many people who have a connection to the world of science, who are Christians, and who are Māori, all of us are on this journey of ako, of learning actually between each other, not just one expert to other people, around how can we integrate these different things. Now, of course, Christians in science reflects the fact that many Christians who are involved in the sciences have also faced a sense of having to integrate or attempt to integrate two things which at times have seemed in opposition to each other. Similarly, Christian faith and being Māori have sometimes been placed in opposition to each other, either intentionally or unintentionally by the church. And I'd imagine any Māori who are here, who have been part of the church for any length of time, will have experienced some of the unintentional and sometimes intentional ways that the church has placed pressure on that. So you take those two and you try and combine all three, and boy, there's a lot up for grabs. So I'm not here to suggest in any way that I'm going to give a lecture on Mātauranga. Instead, I want to talk a little bit more about, for me, how I've sought to integrate my interactions in these three different spaces, which I don't think have to be different spaces, by the way, how to integrate them in a way that gives value to what I see in what to some extent are slightly separate worlds, slightly disparate worlds. I wanted to begin then by reflecting on a quote from a philosopher called Alvin Plantinga, who I found very helpful. Those of you who find yourselves as critical realists as a philosophical disposition will find his works particularly helpful because he's a critical realist. And therefore I think, he's wonderful because he agrees with all my preconceptions and then tells me all sorts of extra reasons to think they're true. Anyway, in his book, which I actually have here, so I'll give you a little... Actually, I've lost the hardcover for it, so it's a very boring book to look at, Where the Conflict Really Lies. He starts by saying, there is a superficial conflict but deep concord between science and theistic religion, but superficial concord and deep conflict between science and naturalism. Now, I think that we might be able to think of ways to modify that for our own setting here in Aotearoa, that there's a superficial conflict but deep concord between science and Mātauranga, and a superficial concord and deep conflict, again, between science and naturalism. So in some ways, when we encounter some of the opposition to Mātauranga Māori, some of that is actually coming from a place that's not strictly speaking about science as it is properly known, but is simply a conflict between a cultural idea of materialism, which is assumed to be, in certain circles, the basis of science, that is then applied to a Māori worldview. And materialism on its own can never function in a Māori worldview. Te taha wairua, if you want the spiritual side of things, is essential to a Māori worldview. And therefore, any account of reality that a priori excludes te taha wairua is one that, strangely enough, is going to run into conflict with ideas of Mātauranga Māori. Now, there's more to it, I think, than this, but I just wanted to begin there. And one of the other reasons I wanted to give my institutional affiliation as my current university of study is because there's a particular, I shouldn't feel this, okay, this is a very unchristian emotion, Schadenfreude, there's a beautiful German word for it, taking delight in somebody else's misfortune. So I know I shouldn't feel it. I confess to you all, my uncle, the Reverend Brian Drake, is sitting there. Maybe he can absolve me later. So, but anyway, I know that I shouldn't feel this, but one of the things that's great about being at Oxford is that the logo has on it in Latin, the Lord is my light. So every single lecture theatre that our dear friend Professor Richard Dawkins gives is done under the logo of a phrase that he profoundly disagrees with and detests being there. Anyway, he's not going to change that. 1,000 years, the university's been there. That'll about to change for him. He's a little blip as far as they're concerned. But nevertheless, it turns out that he has not only got a deep distaste for Christianity, he has a newly acquired but equally profound distaste for Mātauranga Māori. So I don't know if you saw in the after effects of the famous Listener episode that he rather unhelpfully felt that he had a calling to get involved in a debate all the way over here. I want to quote from his letter at some length here. No Indigenous myths from anywhere in the world, no matter how poetic or hauntingly beautiful, belong in science classes. Science classes are emphatically not the right place to teach scientific falsehoods alongside true science. Creationism is still bollocks, even if it is Indigenous bollocks. The Royal Society of New Zealand, like the Royal Society of which I have the honour to be a fellow, is supposed to stand for science. Not Western science, not European science, not white science, not colonialist science. Just science. Science is science is science, and it doesn't matter who does it or where or what tradition they may have been brought up in. True science is evidence-based, not tradition-based. It incorporates safeguards such as peer review, repeated experimental testing of hypotheses, double-blind trials, instruments to supplement and validate fallible sensors, etc. True science works. Lands spacecrafts on comets, develops vaccines against plagues, predicts eclipses to the nearest second, reconstructs the lives of extinct species, such as the tragically destroyed moas. Now, nice little dig there at the end, right? And love or dislike Professor Dawkins, and I have to say I mostly dislike him. At the same time, he has a gift for articulating things in a fairly sort of memorable way. And as we know, there are many people who would align themselves with his take on this apparent division between Mātauranga, a word that he can't bring himself to actually mention in there, and science. And yet, I think there's a particular place here for Christian reflection on this, because it's possible for us to think about the ways in which we acquire, pass on, and make use of knowledge as Christians that is actually a much longer running account of reality and how we might encounter it than the relatively modern one that Professor Dawkins is putting forward. In fact, the university of which he is a real part and of which I'm a temporary part is one that demonstrates that. In fact, for a long time, all that was taught was, in effect, theology, the study of God and his world. And it was understood that the study of the created order, in that sense, was within that wider discipline of the study of theology itself. And so it's actually a very modern impulse to try and draw a dividing line between the knowledge of God and his world and a knowledge of a world that's actually inherently predicated on the idea that God has no involvement in it, if there is even a God. Those are two very, very different ways of looking at the world. And I guess what I want to suggest to you this evening is that there is, in fact, a high degree of commonality. They're not the same by any means, but there is a high degree of commonality between an integrated and holistic view of the world as not merely a material world, and a Christian view of things. And therefore, for Christians in particular, Māori or Pākehā, there's a way of engaging with science here that opens up significant possibilities as we look to integrate Mātauranga Māori into the teaching, the study, the research of science. And to me, this is a very productive step that I think offers a great deal, not only for Māori, but also for the study of science more generally, because it offers a way, well, I was going to say outside of the contest with people like Professor Dawkins, but he's already picked a team on this. He didn't have to, but he has. And so have many other people. But nevertheless, any account to me as a Christian, as a Māori, that involves an account of the world and the study of the world that's not confined a priori to a materialist account of the world is one that I think is both true and worthy of integrating. So I want to reflect on three. I'm not going to try and give a definition of Mātauranga or explore that. Instead, I want to touch on three aspects of Mātauranga that I think are worth looking at in terms of a comparison with how Christian thought functions. And then towards the end of it, think about two other aspects, which the fourth point there in particular, I don't think has been given much attention, which is reflecting as a matter of Christian justice on the use of Mātauranga Māori. And then I briefly want to think about a constructive Christian approach to Mātauranga in the world of science. So these first three aspects. Now, I must admit, when I was preparing this, by the way, I forgot to check with Nicola, how long am I supposed to speak for? Run with it? I mean, I can run for a long time though, so you probably want to set some sort of time limit.
Just keep going.
Okay, all right. First of all then, Mātauranga in one sense does describe a body of knowledge which is sometimes in use. And I put that point there about sometimes in use because I'm reflecting on Richard Dawkins' statement there that science lets you do useful things. So another way of thinking about that is scientific knowledge is typically understood to have predictive power as well as being an account of things as they are. And so if it's sometimes in use, I would say to some degree Mātauranga includes things which are put to use, but also includes things which are not merely utilitarian, which might be valued as knowledge for other reasons than utilitarian reasons. I actually think when we come back to a constructive approach, most people also engage in science for those reasons as well. So not just because of its utility, but because they can discern an aesthetic beauty in it. An example of Mātauranga that we could place into this category if we chose is the ancient art of navigation. So how did our tupuna arrive on these shores? Well, they did not have a GPS. And at the same time, neither, as some colonial accounts had it, neither did they hop on a boat one day hoping to go to the next island in Tahiti or something like this, and accidentally, a very long time later, ended up in Aotearoa. So as we know, they were capable of navigating the vast distances of the ocean using skills that were very different from those that were used in the colonial, by the colonial powers who came here. That's a kind of knowledge that was acquired in a particular way, and it's a body of knowledge that was held and passed on to people, and which I think is also possible to recognise as being true, even under Richard Dawkins' terms. So even if we were to accept his definition, which I don't, but on his terms, this is something which qualifies as scientific knowledge in the sense that it arose from careful observation of the natural world, in fact of the whole world as our tupuna saw it, careful observation of the world as they observed it, that led them to make predictions and to take actions, and it had a utility that was extremely effective. It took people backwards and forwards over these vast distances for a very, very long period of time. Not only that, and this is probably a point where Richard Dawkins would despair, is it also, in that observation of the natural world, it opened up to our tupuna, and always has a Māoridom, to an awareness that there is a reality that is not merely material. So in other words, when I spoke of before, te taha wairua, that there is a non-material, a spiritual, if you wish, aspect to the world that is also equally true, recognisable, and worthy of giving attention to. Now, of course, The taha wairua that our tupuna described before the arrival of Christianity is not the same as Christianity. So I'm not trying to say these two things are identical. But nevertheless, there is a perception in there that I think is unquestionably true and recognisable to any Christian, even if somebody like Professor Dawkins would not recognise that knowledge as being true. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that the Mātauranga, even of navigation and the spiritual aspect to it, already perceived something beyond what a materialist account of science would identify. And therefore the body of knowledge that is there in Mātauranga is one that to me is already a better account of the world than a merely materialist scientific account of the world. I'm not claiming that it's the same as science. The method is not in fact the same, but still it's there. I also want to make another point here. None of us function as human beings by carrying out the kind of scientific method that Professor Dawkins describes there. None of us even carry out science that way. In fact, there is a large and growing body of knowledge that demonstrates that a fairly significant part of the scientific record is in fact not, strictly speaking, embarrassingly, not entirely true. It consists of experiments that cannot be replicated, frequently because they were made up. And yet, there's this comes back to why I'm a critical realist, but still a realist. There is a way of approaching truth through things that are not perfectly true. Science does this, and so, therefore, it would be ridiculous in the extreme, in my view, to impose a standard of correctness, of accuracy, of precision on another body of knowledge that is not the way even the scientific setting functions. But it's also not the way human beings function. And an account of a way of knowing things that cannot describe the primary ways in which humans function and behave is one that, to me, I'm afraid, is not actually that useful, because it cannot describe the vast majority of human life. So again, I would say an account of reality, an account of the world as we see it, that gives weight to the fact that knowledge is not merely acquired through personal experimentation, is one which I think has immense value. Now, then the question is, of course, well, how do you identify within that wider body of knowledge that you've never investigated yourself? How do you determine what is true and so forth? And I'm going to come to that in a minute. How do we acquire knowledge? But I think most of us recognise that you can't simply experiment your way through life. So I had the very good fortune to be on a fundraising trip that happily I had to take up my cross and go to Queenstown and had to go skiing. So it was very distressing for me. And on that, I had a little bit of a blip, and I said to my friend, I've decided to be a real scientist, in the Richard Dawkins sense, and I've decided that I have to test whether, in fact, putting your ski tips across each other is good or bad. And I have now experimentally determined that it's terrible and you fall over. And my friend said, well, you know what, I've never tested that properly recently, so therefore the only way I can know is by testing it myself. And sure enough, shortly afterwards, he crossed his tips across each other and went tumbling down the mountain. But then we thought, is that actually enough knowledge there? Have we done it's only one experiment. So, how long do you carry on? And of course, we all recognise there is a way of knowing that is not simply about carrying out personal experimentation. Otherwise, we would have had a terrible skiing trip, and probably a very expensive and painful one as well. So I'll just leave that there for the moment. So there is a body of knowledge. It's possible for a body of knowledge not to be acquired through personal scientific experimentation, for it to be a true account of the world, and potentially also, in my view, to be a superior account of the world to one that is simply materialist. Another aspect of Mātauranga is that, at least traditionally, of course, it was passed down orally. And this has provoked a number of people to feel rather nervous about it. We're all familiar with stories of fishing and so forth, where the fish, clearly started out one size, and by the time the story's been told a few times, it comes out a rather different size, typically bigger. And I think that has bred in us a suspicion of oral transmission of knowledge that has clouded our ability to recognise how oral transmission happens in other cultural settings. So in a writing-dominant culture, it is of course the case that most of us are pretty rubbish at passing on knowledge that we gain in a precise oral way. And that's only been compounded by the fact that I don't actually have to remember very much anymore because I can simply Google it. So my recall is worse than it would once have been in a different setting, and it's also worse than it would have been in a different cultural setting. But I reckon most of us who have been involved in the Māori world will know that even today, those people who are deeply immersed in a Māori cultural setting have abilities of recall that seem impossible to those who have grown up in a different setting. So I'll give you an example. So my bishop, Te Kītohi Pakahu, I've seen him over and over again. He'll meet somebody and he'll go up their whakapapa and then cross and then back down again through many generations to the point where he's able to say, and by the way, you're both relations. All right? I mean, it's quite a common thing to do in certain ways. But what occurred to me after I'd been spending time with him for a while, I've realised he's got thousands and thousands of names tucked away there. But not just that, he knows you go up there and he married so-and-so's sister, and so it's the precise relations between them all. And sometimes you'll see a kaumātua who'll go back generation after generation after generation and take us all the way back. Now, what I'm saying there is that there is a precision to that. And in fact, that precision around whakapapa is one that was recognised relatively early on in contact with Māori. And the reason that people were able to identify it as being precise was because of an unusual aspect of it that colonial people didn't always notice, but in this case did. So, let's take a slightly provocative example. So say somebody's from Ngāpuhi and somebody is from Ngāti Tipa. So you might think that these people have historically not been always super happy with each other. There may well be reason to think that people would not describe every aspect of the other entirely correctly. But what was discovered was that around matters of whakapapa, even when there was massive disagreement over the whenua, it was so important to keep whakapapa correct that people would acknowledge a correct whakapapa, even if it was detrimental to their claim over that piece of land. Now that's a really interesting aspect of things, right? Because what it tells you is that there's a value placed there on precise transmission of oral knowledge that is preserved even in circumstances which ought to incline people towards dispensing with it, if we take aspects of human nature. And that's because, of course, there's a much higher value placed on whakapapa in Māori culture than there is in, for example, on the side of my family that comes from England. Now, I want to suggest to you that this is something that ought to be a very positive thing to recognise as for those of us who are Christian people as well. Because the Christian story was not initially transmitted in written form. It was initially transmitted in oral form. And the inability for many Pākehā Christians to remember that and to realise how much they rely on oral transmission of knowledge is one that I think has created an environment where it's easy to be a bit reactive and a bit suspicious of oral transmission. But it is the case that the traditions which informed the writing of the scriptures were passed down orally. And we have no particular reason to think that they were done inaccurately. So my own particular area of study is around economics and the Hebrew scriptures. I'm studying a text which I think is almost certainly post-exilic, and one of the fascinating aspects to me is that it describes the economic situation of pre-exilic Judah and Israel with precision. I'm talking about a long gap of time, a long gap of geography, some really significant obstacles to passing that knowledge on properly. And yet, it precisely happened. And of course, the reason is that we are in a particular cultural moment, I'm talking we in the broad sense here, in a Western cultural setting that does not value and prioritise oral transmission of knowledge. But in cultural settings that do give primacy and privilege to oral transmission, accuracy and precision of transmission are indeed possible, and especially of information that is prized. So again, you take the thing of how on earth do you know something around navigation? Well, of course, the fact is that somebody told you. And when you're trying to navigate across to Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific, then a small mistake in whether you were listening to your kaiako properly at the time is going to lead to a very big miss around the rather small target that you're aiming for. And so it ought not to be a massive surprise to us to recognise that this precise and accurate transmission of information took place. And again, I just want to draw that parallel, that for those of us who are engaged in Christians, in science, and integrating those, there ought to be something that we can recognise here around that. And again, to me, it gives impetus for the integration of Mātauranga into certainly the study of science there. It's an account of the world and an account of way of transmitting knowledge that to me is a more rounded one than one that's entirely writing dependent. And then I also want to think here, Mātauranga is also to a degree, or at least one aspect of Mātauranga, is around how you acquire knowledge. Now, I don't want to spend a great deal of time here, other than to say a significant part of that is having an attitude of observation and attentiveness to the world, the natural world in which Māori inhabited, in a way that when you don't have to rely on doing that, you might well be less attentive. And I think that again has meant a lack of recognition of the ways in which that attentiveness over generations resulted in a knowledge of the geographical features, the geological features, the plant life and the animal life, that allowed the identification of things that were not noticed by people who are observing the world in a perfectly valid but different way. And therefore, there is information acquired there. But I want to go slightly beyond that. That attentiveness to aspects of the natural world meant that Māori typically recognised that there was something, I don't know if I came across when I was reading up for this the word numinous, which means there's some mystery to the world that can't be explained by the mere mechanics of the natural world. And I just want to think about that a little bit again in a Christian sense. So often a famous text when you're thinking about that connection with the natural world and how you acquire knowledge is Psalm 19. Psalm 19 is, in our English translations of the Bible, not always quite as clear in the message that it's putting across because of the way it's translated from Hebrew. It's the psalm that begins, "The heavens proclaim the glory of God, the skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day they continue to speak to him, night after night they make him known. They speak without a sound or word. Their voice is never heard." It's a very intriguing thing. It's a contested translation as well, that bit. But this idea that they speak and speak and speak is one that Christians have long held to be true. Jews, obviously, before Christians, and which I think has a resonance in the Māori world, that there's a sense in which we look at the world and it speaks to us. And I've heard people describe it in exactly those terms. And to me, that's something which is true. Now, interestingly, the psalm has a twist in it, and it comes out particularly clearly in Te Paipera Tapu, the Māori translation, because of the way the Hebrew was translated into Māori. I think was actually better. So if you look up Waiata Te Kau Mā Iwa in your Paipera Tapu, you'll find that the first half of the psalm, Te Kororio o Te Atua. So the whole first half of the psalm talks about Te Atua. So you can know Te Atua, so on and so forth. But at verse 7, it changes the language. Tapatahi tonu te ture a ihoa. Now, in Māori, ihoa, Jehovah, is the Māori word, loan word, which is quite right because it's a loan word from Hebrew, for God's personal name. Not for his title, God, Atua, but for his personal name, the name by which he can be known and be in relation with. So the whole second half of the psalm is the way that there is certain knowledge that's only able to be acquired when God reveals it, and in Psalm 19 it's particularly through the proclamation of the word. Now, don't get caught up on the fact that it's the written word, because of course this is in an oral dominant culture. Only a few people could sit with a text and read it. The point is, the word spoken that God had revealed miraculously rather than simply through the ordering of the natural world. That's why, to some degree, I do prefer the translation in verse 3, which says, "They speak and speak, and their voice is never heard," because it's painting the contrast between the way we can tell, when we look at the world with an open mind, there's a mystery to it that points us to something beyond ourselves, which in cultures all over the world is recognised in particular ways that have a resonance with each other. This is why I keep saying, Professor Richard Dawkins' view of the world, his account of the world, is actually the oddity. For most of human history, it was unthinkable. And even now, the vast majority of humans on this planet don't recognise his account of the world. And materialism, having had a brief blip, is shrinking as a proportion of the world population. So again, to integrate Mātauranga is not something which ought to be seen, in my view, as a threat to science, but a reopening of the fact that there is a mystery, that there is something about the world that lifts our thinking towards something that is greater than ourselves, that cannot simply be explained in materialistic ways. It's a method for acquiring knowledge, but I would want to take one step further and say that as a Christian, I think that when the message of the gospel, when the Paipera Tapu came, my tūpuna accepted it because, at least to some degree, they thought this was an even stronger account of what they had always known. So in other words, there was a recognition of it. When you think of the rapidity with which this message was accepted, I just think there was such a resonance with what was already here that even though it was different, I'm not claiming it's the same by any means, it's not. But at the same time, there was a deep resonance between what Māori had already observed about the world and, in a way, saying, here's the story that makes even better sense of what I know to be true. So to me, as a Christian minister, I find to do ministry in primarily Māori communities as a real joy, because our starting point is actually completely different from when I was in ministry in a predominantly Pākehā setting. Because I start with so much agreement about where we're... And then, of course, there is a debate. There's a massive debate in the Māori world around karaitianatanga, around Christianity. But it's on a different platform. So if science in this country could integrate Mātauranga Māori, I value that as a Māori. I also value that as a Christian minister. To me, in both instances, however you look at it, this is a positive development. Now, I'd want to turn from that, just to saying I affirm this in particular ways, to also saying then, as Christians, there's a particular risk and a danger that is one that I think as Christians we could be advocates for. Because to some degree, I think that the challenge, often as Christians, we're reacting to cultural movements that are happening in ways that we have not really been the formers of. So wouldn't it be wonderful if the church had taken the lead around Mātauranga Māori and integration into the science curriculum? You know, if to say sadly we didn't, oh well. However, here's something I want to suggest as a constructive point of engagement around the use of Mātauranga Māori. Now, I'm going to put up a little quote here. It's spread across 2 screens. I want to give you a moment to ponder it, and then I'm going to ask you if anything about it strikes you, and we'll just see if we get any with us. So, Māori knowledge, or Mātauranga Māori, is the traditional knowledge of the Māori people of New Zealand. It encompasses all aspects of Māori culture, including arts, religion, language, and natural history. Mātauranga Māori is passed down orally from generation to generation and is highly respected by the Māori people. Mātauranga Māori is closely related to science. In fact, many of the principles of traditional Māori knowledge are based on scientific principles. For example, the Māori concept of whakapapa, or genealogy, is based on the principles of genetics. And the Māori concept of tapu, sacredness, is based on the principles of ecology. Mātauranga Māori is an important part of Māori culture and identity and is increasingly being recognised by the scientific community as a valuable source of knowledge and insight into the natural world. An example of Mātauranga Māori in science is the use of kaitiaki, guardianship, and environmental management. This approach emphasises the importance of relationships between people and the environment and the responsibilities that people have to care for the environment. Now, you'll notice I've put no attribution to that quote. And the reason is I don't want to skew your reaction to it. Is there anything that strikes you about that? I realise the contested setting makes it highly implausible to put your hand up and answer less to...
I thought Mātauranga Māori meant like Rongo Māori or something like really specific, like because I read Fina Cooper's biography.
Oh, lovely, yeah.
And it was talking about her father would be able to do this fishing and all these little things that she was taught as to be a leader of her tribe. But this seems like a really wide definition.
Yeah, so there's incomplete in certain ways. Yeah.
Lyndon, that strikes me as screaming colonial white what's the word I want? Co-opting of Mātauranga Māori, in order to pay lip service to it, but really just carry on with it. Don't disturb the waka, just keep it going the way it's been going for 200 years. Thank you very much. We're doing fine. But hey, we might put a little sail up for you or something, or a carving on the front of the ship that makes it look like we're engaging with it.
It's a bit shallow, eh?
Where does that come from?
So, I'm afraid this is a little bit of a party trick, because what I did was I asked an AI to tell me about Mātauranga Māori. All right. I asked an artificial intelligence to tell me about a GPT-3. It's a language model. Now, I've done that for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, machine learning as an AI approach merely reflects what is out there. And our lives are going to be increasingly dominated by deep learning approaches to things. And yet, as you've quite perceptively noticed, both of you, you end up with an account of something which is deeply important, which is both inadequate and incomplete, and which reflects precisely the biases of all the material that's been fed into the AI. Now, there's another aspect to this as well, which is around the ownership and use of knowledge, because, funnily enough, this model is constructed over in the United States, and in fact, that's where most things go. So I don't know if you've ever put your sat-nav on and sat there in horror at the mispronunciation of the Maori place names and street names as you were being driven around. You might have wondered, why is it that with all the resources that Apple and Google have, they can't teach their thing to pronounce Maori properly or to recognise Maori words? It's because there's a very significant movement in question mark around data sovereignty amongst Maori, particularly data sovereignty for what gets fed into the machine learning models. So Peter Lucas-Jones up in Te Hiku has done quite a bit of work around speech recognition for Maori and speech, I think speech synthesis as well. But what he's done is he's made sure that the recordings are treated respectfully and are never moved outside of an environment where there's guaranteed safety around those recordings. But then the question is, how on earth do you integrate that into the other things that we rely on every day for use? Now, I'm not proposing here to say that I have a solution to any of those problems, though I think what Peter Lucas-Jones has done is a really interesting example of that. There's Professor Tahu Kukutai down at Waiata University has done a lot of work around this as well. What I wanted to open up is, rather than simply Christians in science being involved in a debate about whether we should have Mātauranga Māori in the curriculum or not, or how we do it, there are actually issues here of Christian justice around Mātauranga Māori that I think we could become advocates for Māori. I mean this collectively. There are ways for those of us who are actively involved in the scientific world in different ways to look at Māori values around things like te reo Māori as a taonga, and think about then, how does this fit into the practice of science as it currently goes on? How can we support people like Peter and Tahu and others who are thinking about this? And of course I think about AI because it was my own field of, where I did my first doctorate in. But I'm sure there will be other examples in, biology, right? I was terrible at biology, so I know nothing about it. But there must be examples in biology where there's not genuine weight given to Maori values in the scientific approaches to biology in relation to Māoritanga and Mātauranga Māori. I think if Christians who are involved in this can start to think about these issues rather than merely the reactive ones, then it would be an opportunity to be allies, friends, advocates for each other in ways that could be deeply helpful, and which I have to say have been extremely rare in the New Zealand story. It's very rare that the church in any way has found a way to take a lead on anything on this. We've just ended up being following along in the cultural trends that are written by other people. So I want to put the challenge out there that if you are actively involved in science, are there ways that you can think of to engage in a way that's beyond simple curriculum integration, but to think about how the process of research, the formation of new scientific ideas, how you can, if you're not Māori, be an advocate for to be a support for those who are Māori and can contribute into this in ways that give genuine value to Māori values. So that in a few years' time, hopefully an AI spits out something rather less colonial in its impulses and rather less gappy in its coverage of these things. Now, that AI might not exist in the United States. It might be locally hosted here, but that would be a wonderful thing to have happen in my view. I just wanted to finish by really trying to round out some of what I've been saying in relation to a couple of quotes from scientists who have reflected a lot on the connection between Christianity and science and other contexts. And just to offer these as food for thought in our own interactions here. So these are written in a very different cultural context, in a modernist Western cultural context. But in both cases, the bits that I'm going to refer to, I think, are ones that were evocative for me of our attempt to re-indigenize, to re-engage our Christian faith in the context of science here in Aotearoa. Now, this one's by a mathematician called John Polkinghorne. He's talking about the fact that there seems to be an urge to find a general explanation for the world, a way of telling the story of the world that we observe that's coherent. And he says that as we look at the world, the more and more we look at it, the more complex the story becomes, and the more our attempts at a general explanation tend to break down when they overlap with other general explanations or when we get into the details of things. And he says this metaphysical message is ambiguous. Either it can be read in a reductionist fashion as indicating that the rich structure of the world is merely the elaboration of a fundamental simplicity, or it can be read in a holistic way as indicating the inadequacy of a mechanical view for the task of capturing the subtle and exquisitely sensitive patterning of actual behaviour in the world. I prefer the latter metaphysical strategy as one that is more promisingly compatible with human experience. He's talking there about the way humans really act. And I would want to push back on that in certain ways, but because I think it can tend towards an explanation of those things which we don't yet understand. So it merely pushes religious knowledge into a category of bits that don't work in science. And I think that's an unhelpful thing. But I think he's actually making a much deeper point here, which is that our preference for a simple universal explanation of things in our encounter with the world doesn't actually work out all the time really well. And that ought to, if we're truly intellectually honest, ought to push us, I think, towards a recognition that there is something else going on. So in other words, a genuinely scientific observation, when faced with this in a repeated manner, is to start to think that there's some other component of explanation of what we're observing. And Alistair McGrath, in his own reflections on Richard Dawkins' work, says something similar, but which I think is a little bit more productive as an engagement. He says, Christianity argues that nature is to be seen as an image of divine things, something which somehow points to God himself, enabling us to see nature in a new light. While not denying anything of what Dawkins affirms about the beauty of the world, this perspective simply adds to it by seeing nature as a pointer towards the greater beauty of God. The wonder of the Creator can be known through the created order. Now, he goes on to say that this idea that in seeing the beauty of the world and the wonder and awe that it provokes in most human beings, he said it can lead to a romanticism, which then finds explanations of order as being destructive of wonder and beauty. But he says that for himself as a scientist, and I'd have to say this mirrors my own experience and many others over the centuries, an understanding of how things work doesn't destroy your sense of awe and wonder. So I often think of, there's the theologian and Bishop Augustine who has this wonderful book, Against the Academicians, which is an account of conversations he has with his illegitimate son, Deodatus. He's an elite Roman, he's walking around the gardens, they talk about interesting topics. I have to say, not many 15-year-olds could hold a conversation like that, or would want to. But anyway, in it, he's talking about concepts that reoccur in people like Wittgenstein much later on. He talks about the fact that words don't have inherent meaning. And yet, he says, somehow as human beings, when words are used, they do convey meaning. So there's something missing in our account. At a sort of functional level, we can tell words don't have innate meaning, and yet they do to human beings. And he says, you know what? This is how it works. It's because Christ, who is the light that comes from God, illumines people so that they recognize the innate meaning. Now, to me, that's a wonderful account of the world. And the example he uses is the one that really works for me, with a geeky scientific background, and I'm afraid does not work for my wife at all. But he says, look, don't you remember the first time you found that a line was a point extended? And he says, wasn't that a beautiful moment? And he said, a line is a point extended, right? And it is, it's beautiful. And he said, in the moment when you encountered the beauty of that, did you not know that it was true? Somehow deep in your being. And I think, yes, I did. Same with calculus, it's just this extraordinary expansion of the world. Now, outside this room, most people will think we're, not that interesting to have at a party when we say things like that. And it's probably true too. But what I want to say there, though, is that ability to recognise truth and its connection with beauty and a sense of awe about it is one that I think is a very productive aspect. And it's something which I see over and over again. Having grown up outside Te Ao Māori, to have immersed myself in the Māori world now is something which I see over and over again. An identification, a recognition of beauty and truth in the world that, to me as a Christian, I can also say I'm not trying to divide those two parts of me and say that in any way that I function one way as a Māori and another way as a Christian. What I'm saying is that those two worlds have been integrated for me because I see the same way of knowing functioning there. And because of that, I think it's not just a curriculum matter, but I think it's a deeply important matter for us to engage with. I hope that's been of some interest to you. I hope that my words, which have been recorded and may be used against me in evidence, have not caused too much hurt or pain. And I also certainly want to say that I'm very open to questions and open to pushback and correction. As Nicola said at the start, these are my tentative ideas. My hope is that I'm going to spend time working in Indigenous theology, and I certainly hope to interact with science as part of that. And so this is a great start because I can say some things here and you can whakatika the things that I've said, and then hopefully by the time I try and talk about it again, I'll say something more constructive. But thank you very much for listening and for your patience and for your engagement with me. Kia ora.